Tana ko te ao marama, tana ko te ao tūroa. Tana ko te kore te whiwhia, tana ko te kore te rāwea, tana ko te kore te tā maua, tana ko te kore te mātua, tana ko maku. Ka moe a maku ki māhoro nui a tia ka puta mai ko raki. Ka moe a raki ki ko hāroa te pōtua tai. Engari, ka moe a raki ki papa tua nuku tua rua. Ka puta mai ko tānei mahuta. Ko tānei rawa ko paia, he haka te takata, ati hei mauri ora. Te mihi tuatahi, ki o tini aitua, ki o tini hākui, hari atu rā, hari atu rā. Ka huri au ki a koutou katoa, nau mai haere mai tauti mai. A nau mai haere mai tauti mai ki raro i te maru o enei hururu. Ka hururu o te toro, ka pare. Nau mai haere mai tauti mai, kei roki i tēnei whenua. Those first words that I gave were the whakapapa of the world, the universe and everything. And the answer wasn't 47. But the world, the universe and everything, and where we started out from in the darkness. There was darkness and then there was light. And light allowed for knowledge to enter the world. And after knowledge came into the world, there was varying stages of nothingness. But after those varying stages of nothingness, they gave birth to moisture. And moisture existing in the universe got together with the great winds, those vast winds that sit out in the heavens, and they started a family. And I'm cutting that story short. And actually another part of the story I'm cutting short is their first child was called Raki, and he's the sky, and he started another family as well off to the side. But the one we're going to talk about today was when Raki got together, or Rangi in the northern dialect, the sky father got together with Papa Tuanuku, the earth mother. And when they got together, they gave birth to the environment that we live in. And that environment that's out there and those elements of the earth, they got together and they created people. And people came into this world. Ka te hui tātou, ka raro i te maru e nei hururu. And here we are, people who have been birthed into this world, gathering under these feathers up here of the toro. These feathers, these wings of the toro, effectively we're sitting in the nest. The nest, which is the home of the mother, which is the home of the baby, the home of life. I acknowledge those people, those mothers of ours, who have passed on. Those old people that have passed on. Those old ladies that allowed us to be here. Those mothers that allowed us to be here. Ka huhi mai nei kia koutou katoa ka haukui. I acknowledge you mothers here now that allow us to be here. Ka te mihi atu ki a koe Sally, mo te mahi ke raro i te maru o tēnei huruhuru kei roki i te kaupapa o te rā. Engari kaori au kei te kaori au he kōrero kei roki i tēnei kaupapa. I acknowledge Sally and her work as a mother, her work as an academic that's allowed us to be here today. And I'm a bit of a fraud because I can't talk about any of that stuff. Engari, kei te kōrero au ki te mahi a ia. Kei roki i te kaupapa o te hapuia. Te kaupapa o te whānau. Te kaupapa o te moika, te pepe, ki te waikanui i te whānau. But what I can talk about is the importance of the baby, of the people, of the families. And what I can talk about and make comment on is how Sally's work has worked in the area that Wahakura. not just the idea of the baby being in the family, but the idea of that baby being in the middle of the family, between the parents. So, nō reira, kei te mihi ki a koe, mō tō mahi, mō tō ara, mō tō mahi ki te waikanui o ka iwi Māori, engari ka iwi katoa, ka mahi o te whānau. So Sally, I acknowledge you today for the work that you've done with our people, for the work you've done with families, but for the work you do with all of our families. Hei oi anō.
Kia ora, Ron, for opening for us. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Haere mai, welcome. It's my very great pleasure, on behalf of Phil Kerr, our Chief Executive, to welcome you all here today for a very important inaugural lecture of Professor Sally Baddock. I've been asked very kindly by Sally to open for her, so thank you. Kia ora, Sally. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about her so we can situate ourselves in the context before she presents to us. I think the first thing I should say is that Sally is a much loved, much lauded and much respected member of our community. We are very, very privileged to have her here with us. So again, Sally, kia ora. I work with Sally as part of the Otago Polytechnic Professorial, and she has proved to be a great guide for me too, living our values of accountability, caring, empowerment and courage. So again, a wonderful opportunity for us to celebrate that here today. Sally has been an educator all her professional life, and for over 30 years she has been here with us at OP. Again, a great privilege for us. Her background is in physiology, which has led to teaching in all the health programs at OP over the years. Since 2002, she has been an educator in the School of Midwifery, and for 7 of these years, she was co-head of school. Her passion is physiology, and being able to excite learners about the application of physiology to their practice has always been a driver for her. This has led to the authoring of 3 chapters on physiology for the required textbook for midwifery across Australasia, Midwifery Preparation for Practice, edited by Sally Pearman et al. The 4th edition of the textbook was published this year. Sally's other passion is research, where she supervises midwives engaged in Master of Midwifery projects, collaborates with the midwifery staff on educational research, and has collaborated with external partners to investigate infant sleep. She has published research papers in high-ranking peer-reviewed journals and presented at numerous international and national conferences on this topic, this very important topic of infant sleep. She is also a member of the Physiology and Education Working Group of ISPID, which is the International Society for the Study and Prevention of Infant Death, and she's a member of the Paediatric Council of the Australasian Sleep Association. She is also a member of the Leadership Council here at Otago Polytechnic, Academic Board, and the Research and Postgraduate Committees of Otago Polytechnic. And as I said, she is also a very much loved and respected member of our Professoriate. Today, she is presenting on the journey that underpins her research on infant sleep. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Sally Baddock.
Well, thank you, Una. But thank you, everybody, for coming along this evening, especially as I know a number of you were here last night as well, in support of Otago Polytechnic when there was a stakeholder feedback session on the proposed changes to the Polytechnic sector. So, thank you very much for taking the time to come back again. Thank you, Ron, for such a warm welcome. Really appreciate that, and thank you for welcoming our guests as well. And as I said, thank you, Una, for your very kind introduction. The place our baby sleeps is a fundamental choice in life. And while it sounds simple, the choice comes at a time when we're often at our most uncertain and anxious. And much advice is often contradictory. So this evening I propose to share something of my research journey through the complexities and culture of infant sleep choices and the search for evidence that may help our understanding. I've enjoyed the support from many of you here on this journey, especially my family. My husband Alan has rescued me from many challenges with writer's block, and his wordsmithing skills have been invaluable to provide advice. Thank you. My children, who as preschoolers, wouldn't recognise them now, but as preschoolers were the inspiration for my research path. And it's fabulous to have both Katie and Sam in Dunedin after many years of travelling and living away from Dunedin. And they're back here as well with Sam's partner Vanessa. So it's a bit of a family reunion this month. So that's really great. But of course, further support has come from my many research colleagues who have made it all possible. So thank you particularly to Barry Taylor, Barbara Galland and Amanda for your help as well. So I came to research through my experiences of being a mother, and our daughter was 4 and our son 1. Aren't they cute? When the New Zealand Kotb study published research that identified bed sharing as increasing the risk of SIDS, or as it was known then, cot death. Having shared the parental bed with both of our children at various times, this was kind of counterintuitive to us. So began a journey of discovery. When I had the opportunity to embark on a PhD, this topic of bed sharing and how it might impact on the risk of SIDS was the obvious choice. And in 1996 was still largely an unanswered question. So I would like to start by giving a bit of background and starting with the definition of SIDS. So SIDS is the sudden death of an infant in sleep, which is unexpected after the review of the clinical history, the post-mortem findings and examination of the circumstances of death. So in other words, when there is no identified cause of death, this is the label that is given to those infants. SUDI includes SIDS, but it's a broader definition to include more uncertain scenarios when risk factors are present, but the actual role that they've played in death is uncertain. And this reflects the increasing focus on identifying and reducing unsafe sleep environments. So right back in the end of the early 1990s, the New Zealand National Kotb study was published, and this was the first international study to actually look at childcare practices and how they might perhaps be linked to SIDS. So in this study, there were 370 families were interviewed after the death of their baby as labelled as SIDS. And they were compared with data that was collected from 1,500 families whose babies were a similar age, but were still healthy. And these 4 factors were part of the really strong focus of the safe sleep messages developed at the time. You can see here that the cases are in black. Sorry, I'm busy using my cursor, but I know you can't see that. So the first bar there is showing you that 60% of babies who died had been put to sleep prone on their tummy, whereas only 30% of the control babies had been put to sleep prone. And the same pattern is followed through these other factors. Smoked in pregnancy, twice as prevalent amongst the babies that died. Not breastfeeding, twice as prevalent. And sharing a bed with a baby was twice as prevalent. So these 4 factors, along with some others, were the real focus of introducing that concept of safe sleep. Further analysis actually indicated that the sharing a bed was largely posed a threat to babies when there was actually smoking in pregnancy as well, rather than bed sharing alone. So, because of my own recent experiences, I focused on bed sharing. It's a topic that has polarised views and still does. At the time, a number of studies identified the smoking and bed sharing combination as the most significant factor, but other studies identified bed sharing itself as increasing the risk. That is, even if the baby was not exposed to smoking. But there was no consistent definition of what bed sharing actually meant. So back in the mid-90s, we launched a study to try and learn more about bed sharing. What did families actually do when they reported bed sharing, and what influenced them? So this study was a qualitative study investigating the bed sharing practices of different cultural groups, and you can see the co-researchers that made up this group. We carried out semi-structured interviews with families from 4 different cultural groups. So 4 families from the Pacifica community, there was 1 Maori family was interviewed, 4 high SIDS risk, which we recruited young single women from a community support group, and 4 families from low SIDS risk group, which we recruited from Parent Centre. So common themes were identified from the interviews around practices, influences and outcomes. It just seems to be a bit sensitive. The variety of practices, the bed sharing practice for these families anyway always included the mother, but sometimes included others such as partner or siblings in the bed. The bed size varied. There was not a consistent bed, sometimes mattresses on the floor, sometimes different arrangements in the bed, and sometimes particular arrangements of bedding. Something that was really interesting to us was the influences on the decision to bed share. And the Pacifica families and Maori identified that advice and support from the extended family was really the most important consideration for them, and that their practice grew out of their cultural beliefs. On the other hand, the other 2 groups, which were actually largely New Zealand European, identified that they were more influenced by outside expert advice, such as contact with health professionals, La Leish League, etc. And at the time was identified a certain sense of disapproval within the New Zealand European culture of bed sharing. The outcomes for the families across those diverse groups, they were pretty consistent what they reported as the outcomes. Having a settled baby, a feeling of security for the mother, a sense of bonding, ease of breastfeeding, reduced parental tiredness, and an ability to keep baby warm. Some of the comments made by the families are included here. I'll read out some of them. After having baby in bed with us for a while, I couldn't understand how you could roll over and squash your baby. Because of my whole Tongan upbringing and my Tongan background and culture, I suppose you share everything and you do things together, right from bed sharing to every other aspect of your life. We've worked it out for her. What's comfortable for her, referring to the baby, seems to be going pretty good at the moment. If we didn't bed share, we'd have to change other parenting practices. And then a bit of a different tone, everybody I know had negative thoughts about sharing the bed. She said the baby shouldn't even be in the same room as you because you were disturbing their sleep patterns. So you can see there's quite a range of feedback there, but for most of these families, bed sharing was really important to them. But also a sense of guilt kind of emerged with some of those families. So we concluded bed sharing was not a uniform practice and was motivated by a range of reasons. It was dependent on context, cultural beliefs, values, ways of coping. And in fact, very similar results have been reported from another study using focus group interviews of Pacific, Maori and New Zealand European families in Auckland, published by Sally Abel. So our next step was to consider what was the link nonetheless between bed sharing and SIDS. And this data, published by Nelson in 2001, also informed some of our thinking. Data was collected from 21 centres around the world. You can see them listed along the bottom, but I'm sure you won't be able to read any of them. That included China, Scandinavia, Asia and Australasia. The purple line shows how common bed sharing was in the different communities, and the black line indicates the SIDS rates at the time. So I don't want to take too much from this, but you can see that if anything, those lines actually go in the opposite direction. So this lent further support for the idea of it was how families were bed sharing was the issue, not just that they were bed sharing. So, to find out, to get some actual quantitative data around this in a study funded by HRC, that we set about collecting this objective data on what actually happened during bed sharing, recording the physiology and behaviour of infants during bed sharing to understand the practice better. The aim of the study was to identify the risks and benefits to babies during bed sharing sleep compared to cot sleep. And so the risks that we're talking about, we referred back to the New Zealand Cot Death study and others. The risk we were looking for was how much prone sleep occurred, that is sleeping on the tummy, how much head covering, how much of the time was the temperature increased, and was the oxygen saturation of the blood decreased. But we also looked in terms of benefits, and so did it facilitate breastfeeding and mother-baby interactions. So for this study, we asked for volunteers, infants aged 0 to 6 months, healthy at time of birth and time of the study, and we recruited, along with Amanda's help, 40 infants and their parents who regularly bed shared more than 5 hours a night. And we matched these for age and season of study with 40 infants who regularly slept more than 5 hours a night in a cot or a bassinet. So we studied these babies over 2 consecutive nights in the home in their usual sleep situation. So if they usually bed shared, that's how we studied them, or in the cot in the parental bedroom. You can see it was quite a nice tiny infrared sensitive camera here and an infrared light, but the stand was quite obtrusive, so it wasn't exactly, hidden away, but parents did actually seem to be pretty comfortable with it nonetheless. On the second night, we videoed once again, and we also had physiological recordings from the infant only. So these sensors were placed on the baby. We sampled air near the baby's face to see how much carbon dioxide was in that air. We looked at airflow measured under the baby's nose, ECG to measure heart rate. This respy band, it's the band around the middle there, that was to measure breathing movements. An oximeter probe around the big toe to measure the oxygen saturation of the blood. And we, excuse me, we measured temperature, rectal temperature for those families that were happy about that, as well as shin temperature and room temperature. And all of those leads were brought together in one lead. You can see it going off to the side there. It was 4 metres off to our monitoring apparatus, so the babies could be breastfed overnight, the nappies changed, but they couldn't actually be taken out of the room unless they were disconnected, of course. So the characteristics of the babies and mothers, whether bed sharing or cot sleeping, were very similar, and were at relatively low risk of SUDI, as the babies were almost all fully breastfed. The mothers had some had tertiary education, and in the bed share group there were 3 out of the 40 mothers were smokers. It was a bit higher in the cot group, I do notice. We had 10 to 18% were Maori. So this was a bit back in the olden days. We had VHS tapes when we did this, and so we needed a VHS recorder to be able to look at them. And we had some software, this is very sensitive, sorry. We had some software that enabled us, Amanda, to be able to log what was actually happening with the baby and the adjacent adult. So what sleep position was it in through the night? Was it awake? Was it moving? Was it feeding? And so on. So it was quite a systematic approach to being able to record what was actually going on. So I'm not going to give you the figures here, just more of a general sense of what we found. So in terms of the first box there, mothers and babies were generally sleeping in very close proximity. They tended to face each other. The baby tended to be at breast height, and you can see as in this photo here, rather than the head up on the pillow. Can you see the head just tucked in the middle there? The baby was usually sleeping on its side or supine, which is on its back. If it was on its tummy, it tended to be on the chest of the mother rather than actually face down into the bed. We don't know if that's safer or not, but it was different. And there were other sleepers in about half of the study. So by that I mean, that, for example, the father or a partner in the bed, or in some instances there were siblings in the bed as well. We identified 3 times more mother-baby interactions when the baby was in the bed compared to if it was in a cot or bassinet next to the bed. The baby and mother woke much more frequently, and this was usually associated with breastfeeding. We also found, however, that the baby's head was actually covered by the bedding much more frequently. That seldom happened in the bassinets. But importantly, the baby's head was also uncovered quite frequently. And here you can sort of see in the your bottom left photo there, a little bump, which is actually the head of the baby. It is tucked right down under the blankets. And the photo beside that is showing it did actually happen in one of the bassinet sleeping babies. It's got a muslin wrap sort of pulled right up over its head, and it was like that for quite a long part of the night. So it did actually happen with the cot as well, but not nearly so frequently. So clearly, having adults in the bed and having adult bedding does actually make for quite a different situation. So the head covering and uncovering, to unpick that a bit more, we were able to show in the first 2 columns there that the baby, bearing in mind they were up to 6 months old, managed to manoeuvre itself around and get its own head covered by bedding about 20% of the time, and the remainder was due predominantly to the movements of the mother. Uncovering, again, the baby was able to uncover its own head by its movements about 30% of the time. But another 30%, the baby moved in some way which triggered some movement in the mother, and that cleared the head. And the last third was the mother herself just initiating some movement. So why we thought this was really important is because it emphasised that it was so important to have a mother that was responsive to the baby in this situation, and you could understand how somebody impaired by alcohol or even being very overtired may not be able to respond in this manner. So again, if you couldn't pick the baby's head, there's an arrow to help you. So we did have a bit of physiology around this, and you can see if you follow the carbon dioxide at the baby's face, you can see these are in the same temporal situation. So that the carbon dioxide was elevated. We could measure that, and the carbon dioxide around the baby's face was elevated when the head was covered. And we could also, also show that the breathing rate was increased. So a bit more analysis. We looked at 80 observations, 80 times when the infants got their head covered by bedding, and the carbon dioxide that they were breathing in, they were rebreathing, increased. So the top line shows you, we compared time when the carbon dioxide was at baseline, 0.5%, with when it was at 3% because the baby was rebreathing the air. And importantly, what we found is that even though the carbon dioxide was higher, the level of oxygen in the baby's blood actually remained constant. One of the things that might have contributed to that was the increase in the rate of breathing that we were able to measure. The other aspect we were interested in was the overnight temperature. So the top graph over the other side there, it shows you in the course of an evening, 8 hours, it summed all of the cot babies' data and then all of the bed share babies' data, and you can see the top line is the bed share babies, the solid line, and throughout the night it was, for the baby's shin temperature, it was about 1 degree higher than the cot sleeping babies. So this is indicating it was in a warmer environment trying to lose heat because the vessels near the surface were dilated, whereas the cot babies were trying to conserve heat because there was vasoconstriction with those surface blood vessels. But it worked, as it were, in terms of the babies, whether they were trying to lose heat or gain heat. The rectal temperature, which is the bottom graph, it remained within the normal range throughout the night. So, considering this bedshare environment, it certainly is a different sleep environment, resulting in beneficial, for example, more breastfeeding, but potentially compromising situations such as getting the head covered by bedding. Infant responses and frequent maternal interactions seem to keep these low-risk infants safe in our particular study. But we could see it could be potentially hazardous if the infant and or the mother were unresponsive. So bed sharing is a practice valued by many, and so it's important to identify really what are the specific risks to this practice. Oh, just to mention that we published 4 papers from this study in terms of sharing those results. However, in New Zealand, more than 50% of SIDS deaths are associated with the baby being found in the parental bed. So there's also disparity between Maori and non-Maori with regards to SUDI. And in this graph here, you can see the top line, the blue, that is the rate of SUDI deaths among Maori through the 2000s. The middle one is Pacifica, and the bottom one is non-Maori, non-Pacifica. And if we look right to the far end of it, you can see at this point in time, the rate among non-Maori, non-Pacific is about 0.4 deaths per 1,000 live births, but the rate among Maori is 3 to 4 times greater than this. So why the disparity? And there's some studies here that perhaps shed a little bit of light. The first one was a group of mainly Maori mothers that were interviewed in Auckland about their childcare practices, and compared with a group of a totally different group, different time frame, but compared with a group of non-Maori mothers. This group was questioned in 2006, and then another group, which is the third column, in 2015. So it's just showing the change in practice. But what's fairly obvious there is that smoking in pregnancy being far more prevalent among Maori, as is bed sharing, but importantly, it's that combination of smoking in pregnancy and bed sharing. So rather than focusing on specifically trying to reduce bed sharing, and of course there's a lot of effort trying to reduce smoking, but it is challenging, the Māori SIDS Prevention organisation redeveloped the wahakura, an intervention that might encourage a safer way of bed sharing, particularly when there was smoking in pregnancy. So the wahakura was a flax bassinet that parents could actually position in the adult bed. So as such, it already had appeal to Māori, made of flax with its sort of further symbolism, a way of supporting bed sharing because the wahakura could actually be placed in the bed and maintain that proximity, but providing a separate sleep surface. And they were rolled out with safe sleeping rules, so some education was provided, but what wasn't known, there was no actual data around the safety or otherwise of these wahakura. So developed the Kahanunu Infant Safe Sleep Study, which was led by Barry Taylor here and David Tiffany Leach. And we set about trying to identify what are the benefits and risks of wahakura compared to bassinets. So once again, we were successful in gaining an HRC grant, and we used pretty much the same methodology as for the bed sharing studies. That is overnight video and physiological monitoring of babies in the home. Again, we were looking for benefits, and these were aligned with, again, the data from the case control studies. So benefits such as was there breastfeeding room sharing having been established as being protective against SIDS, mother-baby interactions and cultural identity. And the risks, we were again looking for sleep position, how much bed sharing, how much head covering, and also, sorry about that, looking for any period of overheating or hypoxia, that is reduced oxygen levels in the blood. So this was a randomised controlled trial. We recruited 200 pregnant women from 2 midwifery practices, serving mainly Maori women in low socioeconomic areas of Hawke's Bay. It was a randomised trial, so that meant once people agreed to be in the study, they were randomly allocated a wahakora or a bassinet. We suspect many of them might have been hoping for a wahakora, but nonetheless that was the rules. They answered questionnaires up to 6 months of age, and again we had that sleep study at 1 month. So this is our research nurse up in Hawke's Bay setting out to actually complete or set up the study in parents' own homes. So she's got her mobile sleep box containing infrared cameras, same type of protocol, temperature loggers, an oximeter, and you can see her in the bedroom. She's got a camera she's set up over the bassinet, because this is a bassinet study, but also another one over the parent's bed, because we wanted to be able to identify any time that the baby was in the parent's bed as well. And you can see the bottom one is showing the sensors that were attached to the babies. Not as many as for the previous study. We're trying to minimise the amount of intervention. So we targeted quite a different group from our previous Dunedin study, and we're really thrilled that we managed to get a sample that's 70% identified as Maori. So that was really great. The rate of smoking amongst this group, it's who we were recruiting, so we can't really say it was great that, that there was a lot of maternal smoking, because of course that wasn't, but it was the people that we were trying to recruit. So education levels were lower, with just under half having less than or equal to 3 years high school, and 60% of the participants were in the most deprived quintile as measured by the New Zealand deprivation score. So the main findings from this study, bearing in mind we kind of used a similar protocol as before, was that there were no significant differences for each of the following. Infant-adult bed sharing, reported at any time. And there was a thought that if you gave people a wahakura and they put it in the bed, well, maybe once the baby come out, it would just stay in the adult bed. But in fact, there was no difference whether we gave the family a wahakura or a bassinet in terms of how much actual bed sharing occurred. There was no difference in maternal sleep or fatigue. And from our video recordings, there was no difference in the amount of head covering of the babies, whether they're in a wahakura or a bassinet. No difference in the amount of prone or side sleeping or bed sharing, as we saw on the video. And equally, the thermal environment and oxygen saturation and heart rate were also equivalent in the two groups. Interestingly, full breastfeeding at 6 months was actually much more prevalent, was twice as prevalent in the group that were given a wahakura compared to a bassinet, which was a really important finding. We said that the wahakura is an appropriate intervention in high SUDI risk populations where bed sharing and smoking and pregnancy are prevalent. Would like to point out, however, though, that while the two groups were equivalent, there were far more SUDI risk behaviours in this group per se than we had had in the earlier study. So the data that we sort of analysed for this, we actually published in, we had 4 papers published around this, but I also want to point out, like the seminar at the Mokopuna Ora seminar, is another way that we disseminated the results. So we were actually taking the results back to the community as well as publishing them in academic journals. So, in-bed sleep devices. The wahakura had been rolled out since 2006 and continued to be rolled out, and even Jacinda managed to get one. They're pretty labour-intensive to make, and so although now there are weaving wanangas in many places around the country where, young mums are encouraged to come along and make their own and use that as a focus for talking about safe sleep, Nonetheless, they are reasonably labour intensive to actually produce. So what's termed the little sister of the wahakura is the pepi pod, and many DHBs around New Zealand introduced pepi pods as part of their safe sleep program. A bit like the wahakura though, that they were introduced but there wasn't any research to look with any unintended consequences or just what did happen when people received a pepi pod. So we were fortunate enough to be able to sort of embark on another study to look at the pepi pods. We used much the same protocols as before. So this time, however, we recruited 45 families who had received a pepi pod as part of the Safe Sleep program at Hawke's Bay District Health Board. Compared them with the babies we'd given a bassinet for the last study. Because they were all from a similar area in Hawke's Bay, we thought they'd have pretty similar demographic characteristics. But in actual fact, with the pepi pod babies, there was more maternal smoking in this group and less education of the mothers. But when we kind of realised that, of course, one of the criteria for getting a pepi pod was smoking in pregnancy, it kind of made sense that we had that greater smoking population. We again had questionnaires that were answered throughout the study up to 3 months this time, overnight video, and overnight oximetry and temperature. Now once again, when we compared the pepi pod and the bassinet group, there was no significant difference in the SUDI risk behaviours. There was no significant difference in the overnight saturation or time in the thermal comfort zone. But we did find an increased heart rate and room temperature in the pepi pod babies and poorer maternal sleep. We wondered if the poorer maternal sleep was in fact because the pepi pod wasn't that comfortable to sleep with, being a plastic box. The increased heart rate and room temperature, we didn't think that this was anything to do with the pepi pod itself, possibly related to the higher maternal smoking rate in this group, because there is some evidence that that smokers do feel colder because of vasoconstriction. So this is very much just a hypothesis that maybe their rooms were warmer for that reason. But nonetheless, we were able to conclude that the pepi pod appears physiologically safe, but may be associated with poorer maternal sleep quality than use of a bassinet. And so once again, we disseminated the results and were able to publish that data. The pepi pod and the wahakura have actually been incorporated into the Ministry of Health Safe Sleep advice, and our studies actually provide evidence to support the use of these devices. So you can see these are the key messages here, particularly saying make sure baby's in their own bassinet, cot or other baby bed. And so I guess the data that we produce from these studies was able to give more confidence to the Ministry of Health in terms of actually advocating that these sleeping devices be rolled out. So a good example of applied research, I guess, with relevance to, to the public and the policymakers. So I'd just get you to cast your eyes down all of the safe sleep messages before we carry on, though, because it's a pretty important part of understanding infant sleep. So as I'd mentioned before, in the same room as the carer, sleep on their back, smoke-free, and exclusively breastfed until 6 months of age, and immunised on time. Currently the messages being distributed by the Ministry of Health and Hapaiti Haora. So finally, going back to the original investigation of bed sharing, there are still conflicting messages around bed sharing. And in this last project, we reviewed all the published studies on the physiology of infants during bed sharing. That is a systematic review. This included 59 papers that documented increased infant waking, warmer in-bed temperatures, increased breastfeeding duration compared to cot sleeping infants, as well as differences in overnight sleep patterns and cardiorespiratory control. So many of these findings were, very much in line with what we had found ourselves. And of course, our studies did contribute to this as well. But there's still debate as to whether some of these aspects are actually problematic or an advantage. I mean, such as increased waking, for example, can be disruptive of infant sleep and maternal sleep. But if it's for breastfeeding, is that the same thing? So the balance of risk and benefit, I'd suggest, also depends on the subjective view and cultural values of the parents. So when we conducted that systematic review, we produced, we identified what we felt were the gaps in the current research, and suggested where we thought research attention should go. So in particular, when investigating SUDI, that some differences noting that some differences are actually beneficial during bed sharing. That research is needed into bed sharing practices in cultures where bed sharing is common and SUDI risk is low, because there are many cultures where that is the case, and particularly in Asia. Future studies could explore the impact of the thermal environment, as that was something that certainly we identified. That we need to have ways of studying infants at high SUDI risk in a bed sharing situation, but there are ethical dilemmas around that. And finally, that further exploration of the benefits of bed sharing in the absence of hazardous environments we felt would be helpful. So I just want to finish with a couple of slides just to present what the more recent data is, if you like. I talked about the New Zealand Kotb study right in the beginning that was published in the early 90s. This is another case control study from New Zealand. Data was gathered between 2012 and 2015. There were 137 babies who had died during that time. Just note, it was 370, I think, in that earlier time frame. So there really have been significant changes, really for the positive there. And I'm just jumping to one key point. You can obviously read the paper if you want to get all of the detail, but in this paper, for families who bed shared but the babies weren't exposed to smoking, this was not a statistically significant risk. But for families where the babies were exposed to smoking and then they bed shared, the risk was 32 times that of not being exposed to bed sharing or smoking. So it really is a significant statistic that we really do need to be carrying with us and being really aware. Similar to case control studies in the UK over 2 different time periods, and they presented their results. 400 SIDS, but of course a so much bigger population, and compared them to controls. And I'm really just picking out just some sort of key points here, but what the factors that they looked at, and they have in the past as well, is sleeping on a sofa, because the focus is on bed sharing, but people aren't always aware that to sleep on a sofa, for example, is really quite a risky activity, and they identified that as being 18 times the risk of sleeping alone in a bassinet. Consumption of alcohol on the bed sharing night, 18 times the risk. Smoking and then bed sharing 9 times, but similarly, if the mother didn't smoke, then bed sharing was not an increased risk. So I'd just like to conclude by saying, in terms of safe sleep, I suggest it's not the place, it's really the circumstances, the way that babies are put to sleep. And there are those key messages once again. And it brings me to the end. I really want to acknowledge the families that volunteered for the studies. You can imagine some of them are quite intrusive. We sort of trotted up to sort of video them overnight in their homes. So we're very grateful for those that threw out all of those studies. And I'm enormously grateful for the researchers who brought their expertise and wealth of knowledge to the studies, because I was part of a team for all of those studies, and it just couldn't have happened without that collaboration. So yeah, thank you very much. And I was going to just make a little plug to say that, well, thank you very much to Otago Polytechnic, obviously, for the support which enabled me to spend this time on research. And with the ITP sector reforms ahead of us, it's important, I feel, that regional autonomy is retained to be able to support research relevant to our communities. So thank you very much. These are the papers that have been produced as a result of those particular studies. Thank you.
Sally, would you like to take questions?
Oh, I guess if we've got time for a few, I guess we started a little bit late. Yep, so yep, be happy to take a few questions if anybody has any. Just surviving in the heat. Not a usual Dunedin problem. Sure.
I'd be interested to learn what is the actual significance of smoking?
Or why should, excuse me, why should it increase the risk? So I guess we've largely come up with hypotheses around that, and certainly, however, there's quite a lot of evidence to show that babies that are exposed to smoking in utero, it does actually affect development of the brain in subtle ways in terms of receptors to do with stimulating breathing, and also other anatomical changes such as the thickness of the airways to the lungs. So I guess we can hypothesise that these babies, if they've been exposed to smoking in utero and then they're bed sharing and they get in some sort of compromised situation, possibly their physiology just doesn't work as well as it does for babies that haven't been exposed. So perhaps they can't respond, whereas those low-risk babies in our study did seem to be able to respond adequately. Okay. Yvonne? I think it's an individual decision. I wouldn't be myself advocating either way, but for families that want to bed share and that haven't got those risk factors, I think it's about being, as a midwife, that you would be about supporting them to be able to do it in the safest way possible. So they were those factors like no alcohol, perhaps not being overtired, the baby not being unwell, baby sleeping on its back and the face clear. But, yep.
I noticed in one of the slides that you seem to indicate that in non-Maori families the incidence of bed sharing seems to be going down. Why is that, do you think?
So one of the answers might be, in terms of there's been quite a strong education focus on suggesting that bed sharing is something that should be avoided. It depends when you ask people if they bed share what they understand by that question as well, because it is such a common thing for people to say, oh, well, I did bed share, but I didn't, I know I shouldn't have. And so it's quite hard to get the real data about what's actually happening. In the UK, there's some data that says 7% of families identify up front that they intend to bed share with their baby, and I'm sorry, it escapes me the actual figure, but it's something like 75% actually end up bed sharing for some time. But then what's for some time as well? You know, there's so many variables, and that's one of the tricky things, like what does it mean if you bed share? How long is the baby in bed for? And is it a regular thing that you do, or is the baby just brought into bed for a short time? So, yeah, sorry, not a very clear answer there, but I think it's a really complex question to try and find the answer to. Leslie?
So I raised my babies as we did in the 1980s, and we were recommended to put ours down face down on sheepskins.
Those nice sheepskins are really thick and, yeah.
And that was to lower the risk of SIDS, and fortunately mine didn't die. So where was the shift there, and was it presumably a parallel stream of research happening that indicated that was not the right thing to do?
Yeah, around the date the actual advice was first circulated, I don't know, and Barry might be able to help me out with that in terms of when the messages about not sleeping prone actually first occurred. Would be early 90s, would it? Yeah, yeah.
The case control study results became public almost before publication. So almost the last year of the case control study versus the first, there was change. So I think there was fairly rapid change around the soft bedding issue in sheepskins in particular. There were some studies which showed that if you put a sheep's head face down and watch what happens, they might let you die. So, so thank God, you know, your baby had good brains.
Yeah.
Is all I can say.
Yeah. The other thing, of course, is why I guess prone sleeping was so popular is because babies do settle better and they do sleep better when they're sleeping prone. But the converse of that thought maybe because they don't arouse as easily. That's actually why they're at risk. But yeah.
Not quite a question, but one, thank you for a fantastic summary. That was just glorious to see the range of studies, and I love seeing how they flow. One of the messages as a midwife that I hear of community is, yes, well, I smoke when I was pregnant, but I'm stopping when the baby's born, or I stop when the baby's born. And I'm really curious how that message gets out there that it's actually in pregnancy that is in pregnancy a bigger risk than when the baby's emerged, is my understanding. But how can that message get put out there more strongly by
I can't comment on how we'd get it out there more strongly. I'll put that one back to you, I think. But in terms of the issue, it's quite difficult to separate out what is the effect in pregnancy and what's the effect afterwards, because people usually smoke right through, I guess. But certainly you can see that, you know, there are or anatomical changes due to smoking in pregnancy. So, yeah, that certainly is a really important consideration and possibly more important than the ongoing smoking. So the idea of, oh, I'm going to stop when the baby's born, it hasn't negated that effect, but how that message gets out there, I don't know.
Thanks for the time.
Tassie.
I was just wondering about the same pattern people that were involved in research, whether there was a difference between the perspective of those who are older and the ones who are younger.
I think that there is a different perspective and things are changing as a difference between Pacific Islanders, of course, who have immigrated to New Zealand as opposed to being born in New Zealand, and I think then the culture starts to change. So I'm sure it is a situation in transition. Yeah, don't know if I really answered your question, but okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. it's quite likely is an important issue in terms of likely to be sleeping, on a very firm surface and with very little overbedding. And that was something that we identified in our studies, of course, that particularly in Dunedin, where the temperature goes down quite a lot overnight, that a lot of quite thick overbedding on those bed-sharing babies. So, yeah, I think that just the environment makes a really big difference, and how does that impact on the babies? Don't exactly know, but likely it does. Thank you.
Who has asked, are there potentially multifactorial causes get insofar that, for example, a mother that was very tired might actually take the child into the bed out of desperation and therefore asleep?
Yeah, I think that's around, like, what are the reasons why somebody's bed sharing, and I think we identified in the beginning there's really diverse reasons, and is it because parents decide that's the way they want to interact with their baby, or is it because it's a last resort and they're just so exhausted, what will we do? And I guess in that latter case, potentially there's more possibilities of getting into difficult situations. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for your questions. Thank you, Sally, as well, for being so accommodating and answering them all. So I'd now like to call upon Professor Barry Taylor to respond to Sally's address. Barry is the Dean of the School of Medicine at our sister institution, the University of Otago, and he is a research colleague of Sally's.
Kia ora, everybody. It's a great pleasure to come and be asked to summarise and perhaps paint even a bit more of the context. I'm reminded of the Google saying, which is not a Google saying, that on the shoulders of giants we stand, and so I think this illustrates really nicely the building of block after block after block of information based on what other people have done and what colleagues are doing, the team structure, and the importance of doing that slowly and carefully with good evidence at every spot. So Sally's been a major contributor to that building of the blocks of knowledge that we now use in our teaching and with our students. So I came here, some 35 years ago to Dunedin, and at the year after I arrived here, 30 babies died of SIDS in Dunedin, and I saw the parents. These days, it's a bad year if we have two, and it's usually one baby that might die of SIDS. A lot has changed, and a lot of the changes in how we look after babies are based on the sort of research that Sally has shown us. But it is quite different now, and actually the meaning of some of the terms has changed quite a lot. So you say smoking. Actually, smoking now probably means something a bit different from what smoking was 15 or 20 years. So if you're smoking 15 or 20 cigarettes now, in this current social culture, I think it means something different when most people, well, a lot of people were smoking. And so the change, the increase in risk now with smoking is probably because smoking itself means something different. And so it's really interesting to reflect on how things are rapidly changing and how research needs to keep up with that. So we're at that situation now, but I just want to reflect a bit about the future, because we're all building blocks and where are we going, because I think this is part of the bigger picture around the current emphasis on wellness. Government, research institutions, whatever, we're now focused on how to be well. And we need to understand wellness and use that concept, because I think we're now thinking about how do we stay well right throughout the life course. So starting as babies and setting the tone. And our safe sleep environment, the bits that Sally's been talking about, now sits in as an element within knowing that a good sleep, a safe sleep, but a good sleep actually influences how you learn, how safe you are, your blood pressure, your cardiovascular risk, and multiple areas, and that this applies also to adults, and learning good habits right through are actually, I guess, where we are as we think, and so setting the context for parents, and especially with small babies, of starting off right with a safe sleep, but also with a good sleep. And I think that's where we're going in the future, defining how do you actually get a good sleep and maintain that through childhood and into adulthood, so as to actually have a good life and live well, is where we are. So Sally, you've made a major contribution to that whole thinking. I want to finish with a Maori words, mā te huru, karere te manu. Adorn the bird with feathers so it can fly. Knowledge, and what Sally has contributed, is producing the feathers that allow us to fly for the rest of our life. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora, Professor. Thank you. Sally, if you would like to come forward, we have a small gift for you to congratulate you. So, well done, my love.
Thank you.